Good morning. I believe we should begin. This morning, we are going to continue with the series of lectures on neuroanatomy that we started. And today, we are going to look at the brainstem and the cranial nerves. If you remember, we've already done major parts of the brain. We've talked about the cerebrum. We've also talked about the cerebellum. So the objectives of this session, one is to look at the components of the brainstem. I believe you're already familiar with this, but for the sake of completion, we just have to say it again. We are also going to look at the main functions of the brainstem. We will then name the cranial nerves in order. I'm not so sure whether we've done this, but I will do it. And importantly, we are going to state the distribution, the functions, and clinical effects of injury of each of the cranial nerves. So this is to remind you where we are with regard to neuroanatomy, where we say that the brain has three major parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. And for cerebrum, we talked about the hemispheres and the dencephalon, where the dencephalon consists of those four, and we've already talked about them. The hemisphere consists of the white matter, the cortex, and basal ganglia, and we've also talked about them. Cerebellum consisting of those three functional lobes, and we've also talked about them. So today we look at the brainstem. The brainstem has three key parts. We have the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So this is how the midbrain looks like in a sagittal section. There's this front part of the midbrain, which we call the midbrain tegmentum. And there's this dorsal part of the midbrain, which we call the tectum of midbrain. Tegmentum of midbrain, tectum of midbrain. That channel that passes through the midbrain is called the cerebral aqueduct. It's a channel for passage of cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebral aqueduct. That is midbrain. This is pons. Okay, maybe before I go to the other parts, let me conclude midbrain in terms of its anatomy. So ventrally, this is how the midbrain look like. This region here is midbrain. There's a region in the midbrain here, which is a depression. And there are these two ridges, which we call peduncles. Cerebral peduncles contain axons of neurons, which come from the cerebrum going to the brainstem. So we call them cerebral peduncles. And so if these two big things are called cerebral peduncles, then the depression here is called the interpeduncular fossa. The term fossa is a depression. So this is interpeduncular fossa, which coincides with this region here. Then these are the cerebral peduncles. And so that's why we call this the interpeduncular fossa. These two things, which look like breasts, are not part of the midbrain, but they are part of the hypothalamus. Those ones are part of the hypothalamus around here. Okay, so this is the ventral aspect of midbrain. If you look at the midbrain from the dorsal aspect, this is what you see. You see 4 swellings, the ones labeled 3 and 4, corresponding with this region here. I told you it's called the tectum of midbrain. On that tectum, there are these 4 swellings. These 4 swellings are called the quadrigeminal bodies. Quadrigeminal bodies. Quadri from the word 4, quadrigeminal bodies. Sometimes you can call them the colliculi. These 2 are the superior colliculi, and these 2 are the inferior colliculi of midbrain. So that's midbrain. Now let's talk about pons. This is pons. Pons is the one that projects, appears pregnant. Here we see pons here. And in this region, you may not appreciate much, but these cut parts are arising from pons. So pons is the bulging part. And this part which has been cut, that and that, which correspond with these, are called the middle cerebellar peduncles. Those are the peduncles that connect the pons to the cerebellum. The same way these peduncles are connecting the cerebrum to the brainstem. These ones are cerebral peduncles. These ones are cerebellar peduncles. The one connecting it to pons is specifically called the middle cerebellar peduncle. Down here, this is the medulla oblongata, which is the same as this. And here we don't see much of it though, but that's still medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata has some of these ridges. Like this one is called the pyramid of the medulla, these 2. Then these pyramids of the medulla contain upper motor neurons, the neurons which come from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. So we call them the corticospinal tracts. It contains the corticospinal tracts, neurons which come from the cerebral cortex going to the spinal cord to control movement of muscles. Corticospinal tracts. Lateral to the corticospinal tract, we have this one, which we call the olive. Lateral to that olive, we have that bulge there, which we call the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So this one is also going to the cerebellum, but connecting the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. So we call the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Dorsally, whether we are looking at pons or medulla oblongata, dorsally, we just see this region here, which is the floor of the 4th ventricle. This is the 4th ventricle. So we see the floor of the 4th ventricle on the upper part being corresponding to pons, and then the lower part corresponding to the medulla oblongata. So that is the basic gross anatomy of the brainstem. What are the functions of the brainstem? The brainstem connects the spinal cord to the rest of the brain. It also connects the cerebellum to the cerebrum. Apart from connecting, the brainstem also houses vital centers. Vital centers are centers that control these key functions. It controls the heartbeat, it also controls breathing, and it controls blood pressure. So the brainstem controls those key functions. That's why if a patient has stroke that involves the brainstem, the outcome is not as favorable as if a patient would have stroke that involved the cerebral cortex in terms of mortality. The brainstem also mediates a number of reflexes. We have visual reflex. Visual reflex is mediated by the superior colliculi of midbrain. Visual reflex is where you turn your head towards the direction of light. If you're walking at night and light is shown on from one end, you'll immediately turn your head towards the source of light. That is a visual reflex. Pupillary light reflex is also controlled at the level of the midbrain. Pupillary light reflex is where your pupils constrict when light is shown into your eyes. Your pupils constrict when light is shown into your eyes. That is pupillary light reflex. Auditory reflex is controlled still in the midbrain, specifically by the inferior colliculi of midbrain. Auditory reflex is where you turn your head towards the direction of sound. If the way you're, maybe whatever you're doing, I was about to say the way you are seated, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, if you hear a loud bang next to you, apart from running away, you'll also turn your neck towards the direction of sound. And that's what we call auditory reflex. Jaw jerk reflex is where you stop chewing if you bite a hard thing. For example, assume that you are eating rice and there's a stone in the rice that you didn't know, then you accidentally bite the stone. The normal reflex is that you just open your mouth, you stop chewing. That's jaw jerk reflex. Corneal reflex is where you blink when something touches your eye. When something touches your cornea, you close your eyes, you blink. That's corneal reflex. One of the important reflexes that we use when you want to determine whether someone is alive, basically the pupillary light reflex and the corneal reflexes. Those are the ones that we'll commonly be using to determine whether someone is still alive or they're dead. For the pupillary light reflex, you'll shine light on the eye. You'll expect the pupils to constrict. If the pupils are not reacting to light, in most cases, in someone who is dead, the pupils will be dilated, they are fixed, not reacting to light. That will be one evidence of death. Well, the other evidence of death is this one, the corneal reflex. If you take something and you touch on someone's cornea, if they're alive, they should blink. If that reflex is not there, then again, suggestive of clinical death. Rooting reflex is something that largely a primitive reflex for children. You wonder how children know that now they should breastfeed. Immediately a child is born, they're able to suckle, and you wonder, how do they know? Rooting reflex is one of those reflexes that help babies breastfeed. If you put, if you touch the side, the angle of the mouth of a newborn baby, the reflex that they should turn their head towards that thing and grip with their mouth and maybe start suckling. But suckling is another reflex altogether. So the rooting reflex is where the baby turns to the side of the mouth that has been touched by something. Usually the assumption here is that whatever is touching next to their mouth will be a nipple. And so the baby just turns the mouth towards the nipple. Gag reflex is something that is used to test some functions. of cranial nerves, but basically the gag reflex is where you attempt to vomit. That feeling of vomiting comes when something touches your throat. You know, the way sometimes, I don't know how many have gone for the corona test, but if they're taking the sample from, not from your nose, but from your throat, a touch on the throat is likely to evoke that feeling of vomiting. That's what we call gag reflex. You don't have to vomit, but the feeling of vomiting, that reflex for vomiting comes. That's what we call gag reflex. So these are the number of reflexes, among others, that are mediated at the level of the brainstem. The brainstem also has motor functions. This is to mean that the brainstem gives rise to upper motor neurons, just like the cerebral cortex. These upper motor neurons control muscles. Now, the neurons which come from the brain to control muscles, the upper motor neurons, can either come from the cerebral cortex or regions outside the cerebral cortex. The ones which come from the cerebral cortex are the ones we call the pyramidal system. And that's why the pyramids or the medulla were called so, because they contain corticospinal tracts. The upper motor neurons that do not come from the cerebral cortex constitute what we call the extrapyramidal system. This extrapyramidal system is largely controlled by the basal ganglia that we've already talked about, as well as the cerebellum that we've already talked about. So this is how the cerebellum and the basal ganglia exert their control on muscles by projecting to the brainstem. Then from the brainstem, you have upper motor neurons, which go to muscles. So therefore, if you have injury in the brainstem, you're also likely to affect the extrapyramidal system. The brainstem also has what we call the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system is a system of connections within the brainstem consisting of cell bodies of neurons and many axons of neurons, which basically actively stimulate the cerebral cortex to maintain alertness. So the reticular activating system maintains alertness by stimulating or activating the cerebral cortex. It explains to you why if a patient has brainstem disease, some of them will go into stupor or coma because now the activating system has been inhibited, and so they cannot be active. They might appear drowsy, they might be in stupor, they might be in coma. Last but not least, the brainstem gives rise to cranial nerves, and we'll be talking about the cranial nerves. So these are the functions of the brainstem. Now let's talk about the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are paired, which means you have right and left. They originate from the brainstem, although not all of them actually directly attach to the brainstem. The first one does not actually attach to the brainstem. The second one attaches to brainstem partially. Then the others now arise from the brainstem. We name them using these numbers and names. The numbers are usually in Roman numerals. So we talk of cranial nerve number 1 up to the 12th cranial nerve, but conventionally we name them according to the Roman numerals rather than the Arabic numerals that we're used to. They exit the cranial cavity via various skull foramina. We talked about foraminas of the skull some time back, and I gave you an assignment to go check on which structures pass through which foramina. That assignment is now required of you today. So these cranial nerves exit the cranial cavity through various foraminas, and we'll be talking about those foramina shortly. Okay, so based on that assignment that I gave you on the skull foramina, I have some 3 questions for you here, which I would want you to answer. I will project it on the poll for you, and you'll have 1.5 minutes to answer them. There are 3 questions. So you already have it in the poll. Feel free to respond to them. So your time is over. I will now close it. I'm sharing with you the results. On the first question, okay. The one that has been chosen by the majority is a correct response. On the second question, again, the one that has been chosen with the majority is the correct response. On the third question, many people have failed, including the majority. So that one I'll want you to revisit. So these are the foramina of the skull. This is foramen magnum. That's foramen magnum. The foramen labeled 10 is foramen magnum. So foramen magnum is where the spinal cord will go through. That is also where the meninges that cover the spinal cord will go through. And so that's the correct answer for question 1. This is also where the vertebral arteries will pass. Cervical meningeal nerves also go through this hole, as well as the spinal accessory nerve will also go through this foramen. Carotid canal is the one labeled 21. Carotid canal traverses the internal carotid artery together with sympathetic plexus of nerves. Internal carotid artery and sympathetic nerve plexus. Optic canal is the one labeled 4. This is where the optic nerve will go through, together with the ophthalmic artery. Those ones are going to the eye. Superior orbital fissure, the question I asked you, that the superior orbital fissure, the one labeled 14 there. Superior orbital fissure traverses the third cranial nerve, oculomotor, fourth cranial nerve, trochlear, the first division of the fifth cranial nerve is called ophthalmic nerve, the sixth cranial nerve, which we call abducens. Those ones pass through the superior orbital fissure, together with the ophthalmic vein as well. Foramen ovale is this one here, and that, or this one here. It looks oval, so it's called foramen ovale. The key thing that passes through foramen ovale is the mandibular nerve. Internal auditory meatus is the one labeled 13, and this is where facial nerve will go through. That is your answer to the third question. So facial nerve goes through the internal auditory meatus, together with the eighth nerve, which we call vestibulocochlear nerve. Jugular foramen is the one labeled 12 here, or there 12. Jugular foramen is where the ninth nerve will go through, that's glossopharyngeal, 10th nerve, vagus, 11th nerve, accessory nerve, together with the internal jugular vein. And lastly, hypoglossal canal, the one labeled 11, is the one that will traverse the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve. So those are the skull foramina and their contents. I want us to now talk about the cranial nerve specifically. And for each cranial nerve, we are going to give it a name again. We are going to state where that cranial nerve goes, and that's what we mean by distribution. We will also state the role that cranial nerve plays, and that's what I'm calling function. And because we are clinicians, we're also going to look at the effects of injuring such a cranial nerve, and we'll just do where I think is necessary. The first cranial nerve is what we call the olfactory nerve. This nerve is not attached to the brainstem. The olfactory nerve exits or enters the cranial cavity through the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. The cribriform plate of ethmoid bone is in the anterior cranial fossa. The term cribriform means perforated or sieve-like. So there are two small holes in the anterior cranial fossa that connect the nasal cavity to the cranial cavity. Those tiny holes form the passage of the olfactory nervelets. They are tiny nervelets, about 20 tiny nervelets that go through the cribriform plate. And so, depending on how you look at it, if you look at it as coming from the brain, then it will go through those nervelets to the nasal cavity. But if you look at it from it being a sensory nerve, then you can say it arising from the nasal cavity, then go through those two small holes to the cranial cavity. Either way, we can say that the distribution of the olfactory nerve is the roof of the nasal cavity, specifically targeting the olfactory epithelium of the nose. Their function, therefore, is to mediate the sense of smell. The olfactory nerve is the first order sensory neuron for the pathway of smell. Therefore, if you injure olfactory nerve, either through fractures of the cribriform plate of ethmoid or otherwise, maybe infection by coronavirus, then you get loss of smell, which you call anosmia. The second cranial nerve is what we call the optic nerve. The optic nerve enters the cranial cavity or exits the cranial cavity through the optic canal. Optic canal is a foramen that connects the orbit. The orbit is the socket of the eye. It connects the orbit to the cranial cavity. So it's at the apex of the orbit. The optic nerve goes to the retina. So we're not talking about it supplying the whole of the eye. Specifically, it supplies the retina of the eye. The retina is the receptor for vision. Therefore, we can say that the optic nerve is important for vision. The optic nerve actually represents the second order sensory neurons in the pathway of vision. Second order sensory neurons in the pathway of vision. I hope you remember the concept of first order, second order, and third order sensory neurons. We elaborated on that during our introduction to neuroanatomy. If you injure the optic nerve for some reason, then you lose vision, and that's what we call anopia. I know you want to call it blindness, but let's call it anopia to be medically correct. The third cranial nerve is what we call the oculomotor nerve. Ocular refers to the eye. Motor means movement. So therefore, it has something to do with movement. Oculomotor nerve enters, or rather exits the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure, as we've already mentioned. This oculomotor nerve targets two things in the eye. First, it targets most of the extraocular muscles. Extraocular muscles are muscles which move the eyeball. Extraocular muscles are muscles which move the eyeball. We call them extraocular because they're outside the eyeball. You know, if you are outside the eyeball, that's the only place where you can move the eyeball. Think about it. If you're in a car, then a car gets stuck so that the engine cannot run the car, then you need to push the car. Maybe it's a muddy place. You can't push the car if you are inside the car. You can only push the car if you are outside the car. That's the same concept here with extraocular muscles. The muscles which are outside the eyeball are the ones which can move the eyeball. The ones which are inside the eyeball, intraocular muscles, cannot move the eyeball, but perhaps they can change some things within the eyeball. The same way, if you are inside the car, perhaps you can only manipulate the steering and the seats and something like that. So extraocular muscles are responsible for eye movements. Therefore, on this note, if oculomotor nerve is injured, one of the, either most of them or whatever, it depends on the level of the injury. Either way, because some muscles of the eye are going to be paralyzed, in that specific eye, the movement of that eye will be altered. It will have a squint, and squint is what we call strabismus. So that eye will be squinted. That's what we call strabismus. As I've already alluded to, oculomotor nerve also supplies muscles which are inside the eyeball. The muscles which are inside the eyeball are usually on the iris as well as the ciliary body. Let's focus on the ones on the iris. The muscles of the iris are smooth muscles as opposed to extraocular muscles, which are skeletal muscles. These smooth muscles control the size of the pupil. Specifically, oculomotor causes the pupil to constrict. And so oculomotor is responsible for pupillary constriction. Therefore, if you injure oculomotor nerve, the pupil will not be able to constrict. As a matter of fact, the pupil will be dilated, and dilated pupil is termed mydriasis, loss of pupillary dilation, loss of pupillary constriction, mydriasis. The fourth cranial nerve is what we call the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve also exits the cranial cavity via the superior orbital fissure. Trochlear nerve specifically targets a muscle called the superior oblique muscle. Superior oblique muscle is one of the extraocular muscles. This extraocular muscle specifically is innervated by the trochlear nerve. This muscle is the one that makes the eye to look down. That's what we call depression. It depresses the eye. Apart from depressing the eye, the superior oblique also abducts the eye, which means it makes the eye to face outward. If you can look at my right eye, for the right eye, that is abduction of the right eye. This is depression of the eyes, that elevation of the eyes. So superior oblique causes depression of the eye. It also makes the eye to abduct. Therefore, if you injure the trochlear nerve, again, you'll be able to have strabismus, which is squinting. The eye will be squinted. But now I want you to know that the squinting that will be generated by trochlear nerve will be different from the squinting that will be caused by the oculomotor nerve injury, because they supply different muscles. The fifth cranial nerve is what we call the trigeminal nerve, called so because it has 3 divisions. So we use the term V to mean trigeminal, but because trigeminal has 3 divisions, those 3 divisions are also given those type of naming system, except that now the first, second, and third are given in Arabic. So we call it V1, V2, and V3. V1 is the ophthalmic nerve, V2 is the maxillary nerve, and V3 is the mandibular nerve. The trigeminal nerve, these 3 divisions of the trigeminal nerve exit the cranial cavity via different foramina. The ophthalmic nerve exits the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure. Maxillary nerve exits the cranial cavity through the foramen rotundum. Rotundum means round. Mandibular nerve exits the cranial cavity through the foramen ovale. The trigeminal nerve or its branches largely go to the face and the scalp. So it largely goes to the face and the scalp. And the function here is general sensations. It forms the first order neuron pathway for general sensations that come from the facial region. And it's not limited to just the skin of the face. We are talking about even the tongue, we are talking about even the nose, we are talking about even the eye. As long as general sensations, it will go via the ophthalmic nerve. If you therefore injure trigeminal nerve, then we'll expect to lose the sensation, those general sensations coming from the face. Apart from general sensations, the trigeminal nerve, and this is particularly the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. The mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve also supply muscles of the first pharyngeal arc. Now, you don't know what pharyngeal arches is, but pharyngeal arches are like the gills of fish. At some point during development, the embryo has the facial and neck region looking like the way the gills of fish are. At some point of development, there's some paired bars that appear in the head and neck region, which look like the gills of fish. We call those paired things the pharyngeal arches. In humans, we have 5 pharyngeal arches. But in terms of their naming, we don't have the 5th one. So we call them the first arch, second arch, third arch, fourth arch, and 6th arch. We don't have a 5th arch, but there are 5 in total, except that in terms of naming, we don't have the 5th one. Well, the 5th one was there, but it disappears in humans. Each of the arches have specific muscles that are derived from them. The first pharyngeal arch muscles are muscles of mastication. They are muscles which move the mandible, muscles of mastication. Those muscles are innervated by the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. So I want you to think through what to write there. With that in mind, what I've told you. The 6th cranial nerve is what we call abducens nerve. Abducens nerve supplies one of the extraocular muscles as well, which we call the lateral rectus. Remember, I told you that abducens nerve also exits the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure to go to the orbit. Its target is the lateral rectus. Lateral rectus is a muscle that also causes the eye to abduct. It is for that reason that we then call this nerve abducens, because it supplies a muscle that causes abduction of the eye. The same way the oblique was also causing abduction. Therefore, the abducens nerve is responsible for eye movements, and for that reason, if it's injured, you'll also get squinting. Now that the abducens nerve is the one that innervates lateral rectus, and lateral rectus is important in abducting the eye. As a student, you really need this nerve, and especially when you have on-site classes and exams. Very important muscle, very important nerve for a student during exam. Sometimes you have a feeling your neighbor knows too much and you are jealous about that. And you just want to confirm, kwani wanaandika nini? Si ati una copy, so you just confirming. So now, in that attempt of confirming, you don't want the invigilator to see you, that you're turning your head. So your head will be looking ahead, but your eyes turn. And some people turn their eyes until that black of the eye disappears. Only the white is visible. You really need abducens nerve to copy or to check aside. And for that reason, the abducens nerve is also called the student's nerve. The 7th cranial nerve is what we call the facial nerve. Facial nerve exits the cranial cavity through the internal auditory meatus. Well, it has a long pathway, but when it's coming out of the cranial cavity, it enters the internal auditory meatus. However, when it's coming out through the skull, it uses another foramen to come out. That foramen is called the stylomastoid foramen. So it exits through internal auditory meatus and comes out through stylomastoid foramen. The facial nerve has a number of distributions. First of all, the facial nerve is the one that goes to the 2nd pharyngeal arch muscles. The second arc muscles are muscles which attach to the skin of the face. Therefore, these muscles are important in facial expression, like for frowning like this, or smiling, or whatever you do to your forehead. Those facial expressions, winking, blinking, those are facial expressions. These are muscles of facial expression. Tailored to that, if you injure facial nerve on one side, the muscles of that side are not able to move. They'll be paralyzed. And that manifests in the mouth uniquely, where the good side, the side that's not injured, the muscles will still be active, and so they pull the mouth to that side. And the side that is paralyzed is therefore not pulling. They relax, the muscles are relaxed. That shifting of the mouth to one side is what we call Bell's palsy. Facial nerve, apart from going to muscles of facial expression, facial nerve also goes to the tongue. And this is specifically the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The target here is not for general sensation, but for special sensation. Taste is a special sensation. If you remember the introduction, I told you that sensations are divided into general and special sensations. So taste is a special sensation. But remember, this is just from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, not the whole of the tongue. So facial nerve forms the first order sensory neuron for the pathway of taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. If then you injure this, you lose the sensation of taste. Facial nerve also goes to the salivary glands. These are the glands that help you produce saliva. Therefore, important for salivation. Apart from that, okay, so that means if you injure that component that go to the salivary glands, and the salivary glands in question here are two: the submandibular gland and sublingual gland, submandibular gland and sublingual gland. If you injure a nerve supplying the salivary gland, then it means that you'll reduce salivation. So the patient will present with dry mouth. But let's think of something else. Facial nerve also supplies the lacrimal gland. This is the gland that helps you to produce tears in your eyes, the one for tearing. That's what we call lacrimation, tearing. Now, here, if you just focus on that one only, then we can talk about dryness of the eyes. And dryness of the eyes will give you maybe scars on the cornea. But there's something else I want to mention with regard to these two functions of the facial nerve. Suppose facial nerve is injured, and by good luck, the axons regenerate. So that's good luck. Now, the bad luck here is that they regenerate in such a way that the neurons which were coming from facial nerve, which were going to the salivary glands, now go to the lacrimal gland. And the ones which are coming from the brainstem that were going to the lacrimal gland now go to salivary glands. What will happen when this person sees food? When they see food, instead of salivating, they'll produce tears. And that's what we call crocodile tears syndrome. It occurs due to injury to the facial nerve, specifically these fibers that are involved in salivation and lacrimation. If they get injured, then they regenerate abnormally. then that's what you get. And worse still is if maybe your boyfriend has slapped you. So instead of producing tears, unatoa mate. The 8th cranial nerve is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear nerve enters, or rather leaves, the cranial cavity through the internal auditory meatus, just like the facial nerve. This nerve has two divisions, the vestibular division and the cochlear division. The vestibular division goes to the vestibular apparatus of the ear. The vestibular apparatus of the ear are the structures that are responsible for the sensation of equilibrium. They form the first order neuron in the pathway of equilibrium sensation. And this is specifically equilibrium of the head. If you then injure the vestibular nerve, you will lose the equilibrium of the head. You'll feel like your head is just spinning. The same sensation that you feel, you remember when you're young and you would just rotate, then you stop suddenly. Then now you feel that the earth is now rotating around you. That is what we call vertigo. That's what a patient with vestibular apparatus injury might feel. The cochlear division of the vestibulocochlear nerve targets what we call the cochlear duct. The cochlear duct is the receptor for hearing. It contains the receptor for hearing. And so therefore, the cochlear nerve forms the first order pathway, sensory pathway for this channel of hearing. If you then injure the cochlear nerve, you will lose hearing, and that's what we call hearing loss. But there are two types of hearing losses. We have what we call conduction hearing loss, or conductive hearing loss. And the second one is the sensory neuron hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss is where you can't hear because you have a problem with the conduction of sound or vibration through the outer ear, eardrum, and middle ear. A problem with conduction. Either there's wax in the ear, there's some infection in the ear, or the bones in the ear have been disrupted. That will give you conduction hearing loss. That's a bit different from sensory neuron hearing loss, which you get if you injure the inner ear. The inner ear is the one that contains the receptor, the cochlea. If you injure the receptor for hearing, as well as have a lesion that affects the neuronal pathway for hearing, then you call it sensory neuron hearing loss. So it doesn't matter which level, even if the injury is at the level of the transverse temporal gyri, if you remember that concept, area number 41 and 42 of the cerebral cortex, we'll still call that sensory neuron hearing loss. If you injure cochlear nerve, we still call it sensory neuron hearing loss, as long as the disruption is involving the neuronal network. The 9th cranial nerve is what we call glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal nerve is given that name because of its distribution. Glosso for tongue, pharyngeal for pharynx, the throat. Glossopharyngeal nerve exits the cranial cavity through the jugular foramen. Its target at the tongue, and the intention of going to the tongue is particularly to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, targeting the receptors for taste there. And so glossopharyngeal nerve forms the first order sensory neuron in the pathway of taste that comes from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. If you injure that, then again you lose taste sensation from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Glossopharyngeal nerve also supplies the 3rd pharyngeal arc muscles. The third pharyngeal arc muscle is only one, and that muscle is important in swallowing. I have avoided to give you the name of the muscle because you might still forget, and it's not a big deal. It's important for swallowing. I may not say much about clinical effect of injuring glossopharyngeal nerve with regard to that, because this is not the only muscle that is important for swallowing. As a matter of fact, it's only one muscle, yet we have many other muscles which are important for swallowing. So you may not affect much of swallowing if you affect glossopharyngeal nerve. Third distribution of glossopharyngeal nerve is the parotid gland. The parotid gland is one of the salivary glands. The gland that's just anterior to your ears is what you call the parotid gland. Parotid gland usually help us to produce watery saliva. So it's important for salivation. If you then injure glossopharyngeal nerve, the branch that's going to the parotid gland, you'll definitely affect salivation. You'll have dryness of mouth. Drying of the mouth is what we call xerostomia. The 10th cranial nerve is called vagus nerve, also exiting the cranial cavity through the jugular foramen. The vagus nerve supplies the muscles of the 6th pharyngeal arc. Muscles of the 6th pharyngeal arc are muscles of the larynx, the muscles of the voice box. We use them for phonation. Phonation is a production of sound, so we use them for talking. You know, phonation from the word phon, it means production of sound. Therefore, if you injure that component, you'll affect speech, you'll affect articulation. We call that dysarthria. The patient may not be able to talk appropriately. Vagus nerve branches also go to the epiglottis. And on the epiglottis, the target is the taste buds on the epiglottis. So that means that vagus nerve also forms the first order sensory neuronal pathway for taste. And therefore, if you injure that, you lose taste sensation, but now not taste from the tongue region, but taste from the epiglottic region. Perhaps you might not notice it because what you taste is largely from your tongue. Lastly, vagus nerve also goes to a number of visceral organs. The organs of the digestive system like esophagus, stomach, intestines. Organs of the respiratory system like the trachea, bronchioles, the heart, the kidney. So those visceral organs receive vagus nerve. And what's the effect there? It offers what we call visceral efference. Visceral efference simply means innervation to smooth muscles, innervation to cardiac muscle, innervation to glands. Their autonomic functions. Therefore, the effects of injuring vagus nerve will be dependent on the organ we are talking about. And so you can do that at your own time. You pick each organ and you see if the vagus nerve innervation to the heart is impaired. How will that manifest? How about innervation of vagus nerve to the stomach? How does that manifest clinically? The 11th cranial nerve is what we call the cranial accessory nerve. The cranial accessory nerve supplies muscles of the 4th pharyngeal arch. Cranial accessory nerve exits the cranial cavity via the jugular foramen as well. It supplies muscles of the 4th pharyngeal arch. Muscles of the 4th pharyngeal arch are the key muscles that are important for swallowing. Now, these ones, if you affect, you'll definitely affect swallowing. you'll have difficulty in swallowing. That's what we call dysphagia. The last cranial nerve, hypoglossal nerve, exiting the cranial cavity through the hypoglossal canal, also called hypoglossal foramen. Hypoglossal nerve targets the muscles of the tongue. These are skeletal muscles. The muscles of the tongue are therefore important for moving the tongue. If you injure hypoglossal nerve, a number of things can happen. You might have difficulty in swallowing. Remember, the tongue is important to initiate the process of swallowing. You might have problems with speech because the tongue is important for speech. The tongue may also deviate to one side when you protrude the tongue. And I'll leave it to you to decide which side will the tongue deviate to. Is it the parallel side or is it the side that's normal? Great, that summarizes the story of the cranial nerves. 12 pairs of cranial nerves. I've taken my time to go through each of the cranial nerves. It is now your time to now put that to memory. But let's see if you captured something. I want to ask you some questions on the cranial nerves. And these questions will come on your poll again. So I'm launching that for you. I can see there are 4 questions on the cranial nerves. So I'll give you 2 minutes for this. I've already launched it. 2 minutes you have. So I'll close it now. I'm sharing it with you. So on the first question there, think, so the one that has been gotten by the majority is the correct response there. On the second question, again, the one that has been gotten by the majority is the correct response. On the third question, here I can see a tie. I explained this. So remember, for reflexes, we must have an afferent root as well as an efferent root. The afferent root is the sensory root of a reflex. The efferent root is the motor root of a reflex. When you talk about corneal reflex, I told you that this is about touching the cornea, and then that signal goes to the brain, and then it should respond by you closing your eye. And I told you that's how you determine, one of the ways of determining whether a person is still alive with you. So touching the cornea is general sensation. And so the afferent root for corneal reflex must be the nerve responsible for general sensation from the face. I told you the general sensation doesn't matter whether it's on the skin of the face or it's on the eye, the tongue, or the nose. Still general sensation. So you pick the nerve that is responsible for general sensation. Now you know which nerve that would be. On the last question, still on corneal reflex, but now the efferent root, which means the root that makes you close your eye. Closing your eye is a facial expression. So that would be muscles of the second pharyngeal arc. So you pick a nerve that causes you to blink, the nerve of the second pharyngeal arc. Good. So that addresses the 4 questions. I'll give you an assignment. You'll do this on your own time, not a big deal. You can take a photo or you'll revisit the video recording and you'll get the assignment. I just picked this from previous exams, actually. You know, right now you people are doing these MCQs online, but when you have on-site exams, usually you have written exams. And this is how we test some of those ones for the written exams. We've already talked about all of them, actually. So it's just you to consolidate the story. The last question is similar to the third question, except that you just change eyeball for tongue. So if you're wondering what you write here, just put this question here, and where you have the eyeball, put the tongue. I'd given you an assignment on development and congenital malformations of the central nervous system. I hope you people did that assignment. If you haven't done, I don't know what you'll do because we might review that today. But before that, I'll give you a break. Our next topic is going to be on spinal cord anatomy.